me just welcome everybody to, so this is the Institute for Energy Efficiency Seminar. Welcome you here. And Leah Stokes, one of our esteemed faculty, is going to introduce Jessica and her talk today. And we have these regularly on Thursdays, several times a month, and we're really pleased to have Jessica here. And so we'll let Leah go ahead and introduce Jessica and all that. So.
Awesome. Well, so wonderful to be on Zoom with a dozen or so of folks and another dozen in person. So it's great to be here. It's wonderful to have the chance to introduce Jessica Levering, who has been working in a research lab with myself and Matt Mildenberger. She's really an amazing energy scholar. And she is the co-founder and executive director of the Good Energy Collective. I'm sure we're going to learn a little bit about that today. It's a policy and research organization that's building the progressive case for nuclear energy as an essential part of the broader climate agenda. And Lord knows I still come across anti-nuclear people on the regular, so that is not easy work to make that case. That's not an easy one. Jessica really has an extensive background in working in climate. She worked for the Breakthrough Institute for quite a while before she went back and did her PhD. And she completed her PhD in 2017 at Carnegie Mellon University's Engineering and Public Policy program, which is an amazing program that has placed all kinds of super cool people all around the world. So it's really an awesome collective of folks there. And her research today focuses on how commercial nuclear trade affects international security standards and how very small nuclear reactors could be deployed at the community level. So anybody wants to ask me about small modular reactors, I send them to Jessica because she knows way more about that for me than me. So she's also a fellow with the Energy for Growth Hub and looking at how advanced nuclear can be deployed in emerging economies. And she's a senior visiting fellow at the Fastest Path to Zero initiative, which is at the University of Michigan. So Jessica does lots of cool stuff. She's also kind of a UCSB and lives in town locally and is finishing a paper right now with myself and Emma Franzlau, who's in the audience, and they've never met in person before. So that's a collaboration academically in the 21st century. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jessica to give a great talk today.
Thank you, Leah. A very kind introduction. Okay, I'm going to, does it make sense for me to have video on for Zoom participants?
Sure.
Okay.
The main thing folks might want to see is your slides, I bet.
We figured out how to make this work.
It's looking good over here, just so you know. You just have to go full screen and it's all perfect.
And then,
Perfect.
Good. Okay. Oh, and then now I've got the controls. Okay.
Good.
Yes.
Cool.
Everything looks good on Zoom?
And by the way,
Perfect.
So she'll take questions during.
Yes, and I'm happy to be interrupted. And I've also left time, I think, at the end for questions. So Leah gave a great introduction to me. These are my affiliations. The main one is Good Energy Collective. That's where I'm the executive director. And we work on progressive nuclear policy. And if you think those two things are an oxymoron, that's why we founded in 2020. So we develop policy more for deploying nuclear at the community scale and focusing on making sure benefits and economic development go towards communities and particularly under-resourced communities. So I was told this crowd didn't need too much in-depth background on what is nuclear power. So I did want to give a really short introduction to nuclear, just in case some folks are not as familiar with what it is, how it works, but it's going to be really brief. I am going to focus most of my talk on new nuclear technologies and kind of what's happening in the policy space, as well as challenges for nuclear and some of the ongoing policy issues. Okay, so at the very basic level, nuclear is just another way to boil water. And so I've put this schematic of a power plant up, and everything you see on the right side, that could be any sort of thermal power plant. That's what a coal plant looks like. That's what a gas combustion plant looks like. It's also what a nuclear power plant looks like. The only thing that's different is what's on the left, that heat source. That could be where your coal boiler is or your gas turbine, but in this case for nuclear, it's where the nuclear reactor goes. And that's bouncy. And we say colloquially that a nuclear power plant burns uranium for fuel. But that is just sort of a layman's term for what's happening in there. So in reality, nuclear fuels, which are usually uranium, they don't burn because what we mean by burn is technically combustion, chemical reaction where you're breaking molecular bonds. And what's happening in a nuclear reaction is fission, which is where the atom splits apart and releases a bunch of energy. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but the big things why it matters and why it's important that we're not doing combustion is that when you break apart that atom and release all that energy, you have zero emissions, so no CO2, no water vapor coming out like you do with combustion, and you also have extreme fuel density. And so I like this little comic from XKCD that's showing the fuel density of different fuels. So sugar, coal, fat, gasoline, they're all around in the tens of units megajoules per kilogram. And uranium is about 76 million. So many orders of magnitude more dense. And the reason for that is that it's a completely different process for how you're getting energy out of the fuel. And that kind of gives us a little background of why nuclear is so different, even though in the power sector, we think of nuclear, it operates much like any kind of thermal power plant, but it is very different from an environmental perspective. So one slide on traditional nuclear, which the nuclear that operates around the world today, for the most part, was generating 20% of electricity in the US, 10% of electricity globally, is what we call light water reactors. And light water is just the scientific name for normal water. Most of about 85% of the reactors around the world today, there's about 500 operating nuclear reactors around the world, are light water reactors. So that's kind of the standard normal. They're very big, usually over 1,000 megawatts, so over a gigawatt. Most of them are what we call pressurized water reactors, but there's also a set that's boiling water reactors. I'm not going to go into that. The other 20%, 15% is what are called heavy water reactors. That's what Canada entire fleet is, a heavy water reactor, and most of India also uses heavy water. I am not going to go into heavy water at all, but if you're interested, let me know. The big companies that you've probably heard of, like Westinghouse, General Electric, Areva, Toshiba, Hitachi, Mitsubishi, and even Rosatom in Russia, they all do light water reactors. Okay, so why nuclear? This is just going to be one slide. We'll get into why not nuclear in some of the later slides, but back when most of our nuclear fleet in the US and around the world was built out was in the 1970s. There's a big expansion of nuclear back then. And the main driver was the oil crisis and energy security. There was a belief that, coal was running out, maybe in the future. There was an oil crisis, and a lot of countries at the time did use oil for electricity generation. So they built out big nuclear fleets to get off oil. And to supply electricity for growing populations. We still had the baby boom in US and Europe, and also heavy industrialization, not just in US and Europe, but also around the world, particularly in East Asia and South Asia. And then in places like the US, we had more growing concern around air pollution. The Clean Air Act did incentivize some nuclear, more so in Europe than in the US. But those were the main drivers. And nuclear at the time was really seen as sort of the future of electricity production. Today, some of the drivers are different and some of them are the same. So I think climate change is a much bigger motivator, particularly for young people working in nuclear and working at environmental think tanks and organizations. It's also what's caused a bit of a shift in perceptions of nuclear for environmentally concerned folks. But energy security is still a big concern, particularly in the last year after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and concerns around cutoff of natural gas supply in Europe. There's been a lot of renewed interest in keeping nuclear open, building new nuclear to get Europe off of Russian gas. More in the US, but also in Europe this past year, grid stability and sort of keeping the lights on kind of brought focus back to nuclear. And then while demand for electricity has stagnated in North America and Europe, in a lot of emerging economies, rapidly industrializing economies in the global south, there is huge demand growth in electricity. That's only going to keep going through 2050. And so they're really interested in nuclear to help grow their industrial sector, help meet their growing demand for electricity. So there's lots of problems with nuclear. I'm sure you're familiar with many of them, but the main issue for nuclear right now, in terms of why it's not used more, and why that huge growth in the 70s and 80s slowed down, is cost. Particularly for plants that have been built or still under construction in the last decade. There's been a big problem with cost overruns and project delays. So things are taking a lot longer to build and they're way over budget. I will give this one caveat that even with these huge cost overruns, the electricity coming out of these plants will still be pretty cheap because they're huge. They generate a ton of electricity over 80 to 100 years. But for modern market systems, financing these projects is really tough. And it can bankrupt a utility, especially if it's on the smaller side. So we definitely, if there is a future for nuclear, it needs to come down in cost. I'm going to talk about how we might make that happen. But I did want to touch on how cost has become more of an issue, is that the market has also changed. So back when we built out these big fleets of nuclear in the 70s and 80s, mostly we were looking at vertically integrated utilities, often state-owned utilities in Europe and in East Asia. You had huge demand growth, so utilities could justify those investments to their shareholders, or just, in terms of they would get a return on their investment. And oil and gas were pretty expensive, particularly during the oil crisis in the 1970s. But we didn't yet have hydraulic fracturing in the US, so natural gas or fossil gas was also quite expensive at the time. And that now, some of these are different, some of these are more so. So now, for the most part in North America and Europe, again, there's deregulated and liberalized utilities. Also in a lot of emerging economies are also deregulating their utilities. That makes it harder to do big capital intensive projects. But on the flip side, there's a lot more incentives for zero carbon energy now. And you see this in a lot of different forms. But as a counter to nuclear, in the US at least, we have very cheap fossil gas, cheap renewables, that's a good thing. But it's really shifted sort of the attractiveness of nuclear in some cases. But on the plus side for nuclear, we do have a need for low carbon heat for industry and hydrogen production, and nuclear can provide that. It's one of the only ways you can do it in a low carbon way. So that's a potential new market for nuclear. So this is kind of why there's interest in nuclear, again, or renewed interest, but why it needs to look very different, have different business models, be much cheaper. And so that is why there is this big focus in the policy space in the industry around what we call advanced nuclear. And I put it in quote marks because none of these technologies are new. Everything that I'm going to show you, the technology was probably developed in the 60s or 70s, but it was never deployed commercially. That doesn't mean it's, just on paper. The US built a ton of these demonstration reactors. France operated a 1 gigawatt fast breeder reactor for several decades. So it's not unproven technology. What wasn't proven back then was the commercial viability of these technologies. And the other big thing that's changed is material science. So we can do a lot of things that we couldn't do back then with materials that make some of these technologies easier. So I'm going to dive into a little bit of what's happening with advanced nuclear today, what sort of the new projects look like, and what's kind of ongoing challenges. So I show this picture where we're not going to go through all of these. These are kind of the big 6 of advanced nuclear, and I'm not going to go into these technical details. If you want to look up Gen 4 nuclear, these are the 6 like Gen 4 nuclear technologies. What I'm going to focus on is what are some of the benefits or attributes of advanced nuclear broadly that make people interested in them. So big categories. We have small modular reactors. Just a question, who has heard that term before? Okay, so they are what they sound like. For the most part, and this definition really changes depending on who you talk to, they are small, so under 300 megawatts electric. So just to remind you, traditional nuclear that we operate today is usually 1,000 megawatts or higher. Small modular is defined as under 300 megawatts electric, so much smaller. And then usually it's light water reactor technology. So kind of familiar technology, just scaled down. And then the big thing is modular. So that can be the whole thing is factory fabricated, or major components are factory fabricated and assembled on the site. Depends on the size and the technology. There's also microreactors, which was a big focus of my doctoral research. Those are defined as anything less than 10 megawatts. So that's really small. They usually are about the size of a shipping container. So just to get your head wrapped around that, they have a lot of other features that I won't go into too much. The one thing that I think is really important is they have lifetime cores. And what that means is they don't do any refueling on site. So if you were to purchase a microreactor, it would come to you fully fueled and sealed. You would run it for 10 to 30 years. And then when it's spent, you ship the whole thing back and it gets refueled at a central facility. So it's very different than how traditional nuclear operates, which is refueled about every 2 years. And it's a huge process. You shut down the whole plant for a month to do the refueling. So yes.
So if you can repeat the question. So
Yeah.
My question is, what waste from this new process?
Yeah, so it's the question was, yes, what happens to the nuclear waste with this new process? It's very similar to what happens with it now, which is nothing. That's an issue we'll talk about, but it would get taken out at the central facility and it would be stored on site, which is what we do today at traditional nuclear. Is when the fuel comes out every 2 years. It's cooled in pools for a few years and then it's moved to dry cast and stored on site. The US is one of the only countries that doesn't have a solution for their spent fuel. There are things you can do with it. The US is just very slow. We can talk more about that. The other big category of advanced nuclear is what we call non-light water reactors. And that's a very loose definition of anything that is not a light water reactor. So there's a lot of different coolants, molten salt, liquid metal, gas, you have helium cooled or carbon dioxide cooled, different fuels. Instead of just uranium, sometimes it's thorium, sometimes it's plutonium. You have different moderators. We won't go into that, but there's a lot of different designs. They can be small, so you can have a small modular reactor or a microreactor that's not light water reactor. I'll show you some examples of that. But they don't have to be. So a lot of these designs are in the 200 to 600 megawatts, so more like a gas turbine size. Broadly, all of these non-light water reactors are aiming to solve problems from traditional nuclear, mainly economic problems. So they have improved safety, simpler engineering, that's a big one, better fuel efficiency and higher burnup, which means you have less spent fuel left over at the end. They use up more of that nuclear fuel. So that's a lot, and there's a lot of different technologies. I'm going to go into a couple of them that I think are farthest along, most interesting. But the one big feature that almost all of these non-light water reactors and almost all advanced nuclear has that's really important is what we call passive safety or intrinsic safety. And what that means, if you're not an engineer, is that the safety is based on physics and physical properties rather than engineered systems. One example of that I find most people, even if you're not an engineer, can grasp is a lot of these rely on convective cooling rather than forced cooling with pumps. And so it's kind of like your pot of hot water on the stove. The hot water rises, and as it cools, it falls back down. So you don't have to have pumps at the bottom pushing that water through constantly. So if something goes wrong with the reactor, the power turns off, it will cool down naturally over time. And you don't have to have all these redundant electrical systems to keep those pumps running in the case of some sort of accident. The other big one is that most of them use fuels that can't melt. They're either liquid, which is already melted, or they are ceramics based, which means they could melt, but it would sort of need to get to, the core of the sun temperature, which is not really feasible in any of these reactor designs. So that's also promising. And the big thing here, nuclear already is very safe, but the key here is that with intrinsic safety, you can have much simpler designs from an engineering perspective, and that can make it cheaper and easier to manufacture. So sometimes people might think that if you want something safer, it has to be more expensive. But in this case, because you're shifting from engineered systems to physical processes to manage that safety, you can get things that are safer and cheaper due to simplified or less complexity with the engineering. And that cheaper and easier to manufacture is key, because that's really the big paradigm shift that's going on with nuclear technologies right now, is a shift from building nuclear as a large infrastructure project, like a hydroelectric dam or a highway system. So something that's manufactured like a commercial product. And I'll give some examples of how this is done. Now, this is a big if, because we've never built nuclear like this, but this is how every other electricity generating technology is built, basically, except for large coal plants, hydroelectric. But factory fabrication really is the norm everywhere else. So we see that with wind and solar, of course, but also even large combined cycle gas turbines are built in a factory setting. But because nuclear has much more rigorous safety regulations, the analogy that's maybe a little better, and this is what folks working on the engineering think of more, is wide body aircraft. So these are very large, very complex. They have very strict safety regulations, but they are built on a factory assembly line. And this is a Boeing 787. The list price for that is about 250 to 300 million. And the power output of the engines, which they usually have two turbines, is about 3 megawatts each. So kind of a similar power output. And even some of the same manufacturers that build these turbines on wide body aircraft are also looking at doing SMR. So General Electric, Rolls-Royce, so could be quite similar. And so there's a lot of parallels from the business side of looking at how wide body aircraft are manufactured and how they're licensed with new nuclear. So there's a lot of companies around the world. They are quite concentrated in the US. There's about 60 companies working on advanced nuclear designs just in the US. Some of them, not all of them, have significant private investment. There's a lot of VC money going into new nuclear, but not all of them are going to be successful. So I'm going to focus just on a couple examples from kind of the most,
So there's a question from online that's sort of appropriate here. I'll ask you to repeat it. So the question from Andrew Safala is Quayside, Industrial Partners. Are any of the categories of advanced nuclear growing faster than the rest? So
yeah, are any of the categories of advanced nuclear growing faster than the rest? So I would say that in terms of agreements signed for actual purchases, small modular reactors that are, particularly the ones based on more familiar light water reactor technology, probably are farther along in terms of technical feasibility. Some of the microreactor concepts are aiming to get built first because they're so small and simple. They think they can get their licensing faster. We don't know that yet. So that's kind of where it is. Yeah.
Thanks, that's good.
Okay. Speaking of which, the first one I'm going to touch on is NuScale, which is a light water reactor, small modular reactor, spun out of Oregon State University. I did want to touch on just one little more difference between kind of traditional nuclear and new nuclear. Traditional nuclear, a lot of the companies had military ties for the original designs. They were kind of doing contracts both with the military and with power sector to develop their technology. With advanced nuclear, you do still see some of those big companies like Westinghouse, GE, but a lot of these companies come out of universities and don't have those same ties. So it's a little bit different. You'll see that. So NuScale came out of Oregon State. It's a 70 megawatt reactor, so quite small, but they're designed to be built in 6 packs or 12 packs. So when you add that up, it looks more like the size of a traditional nuclear power plant, or really a traditional coal plant, which is what they are aiming to replace. It does have some passive safety features, although it is a pretty familiar technology. Their first project is planned to be constructed in Idaho, but provide power to a group of municipal utilities in Utah. And they just signed an agreement with Romania to do, I think, a 4-pack of reactors, if I'm not mistaken. Like, it might be a 6-pack, but a big power plant, public-private partnership in Romania. Okay, this is maybe also equally far along is TerraPower, their Natrium reactor. They're a joint venture. TerraPower is based in Washington State. They have a joint venture with GE Hitachi, which has a lot of experience manufacturing nuclear. Their design is very different. It's liquid metal cooled. And the interesting thing about the Natrium reactor is that it has integrated energy storage. So they operate most of the time at about 350 megawatts, but they can provide up to 500 megawatts of peaking power. So they're looking to meet that market need of able to provide peaking power, which is normally what a natural gas turbine can do on the grid. They use higher enriched fuel, which I did not go into enrichment, but it's kind of like there's more cream in their milk. And the US doesn't actually produce this fuel. They were going to get it from Russia. They cannot do that anymore. So this is a big challenge that they're grappling with, and actually a lot of the advanced reactor companies are grappling with. I'll show you some legislation that's gone through. It's many pieces of legislation and many discussions in Congress right now are all about HALEU, which is the term for this higher enriched fuel, high assay, low enriched uranium. So everyone's scrambling a bit. It's not hard to make. We've made it in the past. We could get it somewhere else. It's just Russia was one of the largest fuel suppliers for a long time because they were the cheapest. So now there's a lot of scrambling. Oklo is a company that's actually based in Mountain View, California. Their Aurora microreactor is 1.5 megawatts, so that's tiny. That's less than a typical wind turbine in terms of power output. They have a lifetime core, so they operate, I think, 25 years between refuelings. Fits in 2 shipping containers, and they don't use any water to cool their reactor or generate electricity. So it could be good for arid regions. And it's built below grade, which is underground, basically. They're also trying to make very aesthetically pleasing buildings, as you can see. But it's a very different model, very simplified design. They don't have moving parts in their reactor core. And they are looking to, they're aiming to build their first commercial demonstration before 2027. Also in Idaho. But just last week, they announced that they have a new contract signed for a project in Piketon, Ohio, for a larger reactor, a 15 megawatt reactor that they're going to build 2 of to power a port in Ohio. And that's what it looks like. But if you want to learn more, look up Oklo, Ohio. It just came out, so I don't know too much more details of that. But they're looking at building or licensing a couple different size designs. Just a couple more to touch on. I'm not going to read through all these details. Kairos, spun out of UC Berkeley. Their focus is on taking a lot of different proven technologies from the power sector, from other industries, and putting them together. It's a salt-cooled pebble fuel that uses a combined cycle gas turbine for generating electricity. Not the gas part, they're using the heat from the nuclear reactor to spin that turbine. Their first demonstration is going to be in Tennessee, and it's 145 megawatts. And then X Energy, they have a couple different size designs. They're also looking at building in packs. So their main design is 10 megawatts that they build in a 4-pack. It's a gas-cooled reactor, also uses pebble fuel. I didn't explain what that means, but it's there. And their first demonstration that they just announced a few months ago is actually with Dow Chemical for an industrial site in Texas on the Gulf Coast. So they are not going to be partnering with the traditional utility for their project. They are going to use the electricity on site, but they're also going to use a lot of the process heat for chemical processes at that Dow site. And then I did just want to give some big picture, like other things people are interested in advanced nuclear for in general. So micro reactors for off-grid applications. This was a big focus of my doctoral work, was looking at micro reactors on microgrids and how they work with renewables and diesel generation and batteries to meet real loads for off-grid communities. Several companies are looking at doing shipyard construction, which is how natural gas tankers are built, nuclear submarines, but building the reactor on a boat in a shipyard and then shipping it to a site for coastal applications. And then a big focus, at least in the Biden administration and recent policy, and a lot of our work is on coal to nuclear repowering. So this is building nuclear at a coal power plant site using a lot of the existing infrastructure, like transmission lines, cooling water, rail lines, road lines, things like that. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but there's a lot of policy going on right now around how to help phase out coal in the US and in Europe, and there's a lot of interest in using nuclear to do that. And then the last one, industrial heat and hydrogen production. I mentioned this for some of these companies, but that's something, a unique attribute of nuclear. When we're looking at deep decarbonization outside of the power sector, that could be really important because it's difficult to do with other renewable technologies. Okay, making good time. So policy needs, progress, and also some of the challenges. So if you're not in the space, you might not know, there's been a ton of bipartisan legislation around advanced nuclear in the last decade. So Nuclear Energy Innovation Modernization Act, NECA, what is the C stand? I can't remember. Both of these put more resources into commercializing advanced reactor technologies and modernizing the licensing. There was a lot in the bipartisan infrastructure law, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, CHIPS and Science Act passed last year, and the Inflation Reduction Act. There's also been several states that have been passing clean energy and zero carbon targets or mandates that are inclusive of nuclear, and you've even seen some zero carbon credits, so like an RPS or like a renewable energy credit, but that can go towards nuclear or large hydro. Sometimes they're called ZECs, zero carbon energy credits. Yeah, ZECs. So lots been happening over the last decade, but really in the last year, we've seen a big push. So there's been sort of a renewed sense of urgency for a couple of reasons. So I live here in California. I'm sure all of you do as well. Maybe not some of you on Zoom, but we've been having some trouble in the summer around capacity shortfalls and not being sure we have enough electricity when it's getting really hot and everyone's running their electricity or running their air conditioning. This has also been going on in Europe and Japan. And I say those two places because last summer I was living in Sweden and all anyone could talk about was the energy crisis. And then I went to Japan for several weeks and it was the same there. They were having huge power shortfalls. The lights are going out all the time. They were asking factories to shut down. And so it kind of came to a head in all these places where I lived, that there was renewed interest in nuclear just to keep the lights on. And just to keep sort of the economies going. So Japan has been working to restart a bunch of their reactors since Fukushima. They accelerated that process this past winter because they didn't have enough electricity. California had a big reversal. We were supposed to shut down our last nuclear power plant this year, got extended 5 years due to a change from Governor Newsom. And Sweden, which had a national referendum to phase out nuclear by 2010, They didn't. The nuclear is still running, and now the government is considering building more nuclear at existing sites. And even Greta Thunberg said that Germany should keep their nuclear plants open. They didn't listen to her. They just closed their last nuclear power plant, and that's a challenge because they are don't have enough natural gas to burn right now. They do have plenty of coal though, so they're fine. I mentioned some of these big investments. As I said, the Biden administration has always been very supportive of nuclear, but they're also been quite aggressive on climate change, which I think was maybe a surprise for some folks, but we've been excited to see that convergence. So the Inflation Reduction Act had a lot of new incentives and a lot of new funding for nuclear. It's really more technology neutral policy, so production tax credits, investment tax credits, clean hydrogen credits, and then the bipartisan infrastructure law had some support for existing nuclear, particularly plants that were struggling financially, and then a big chunk of funding for the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, which is what's funding TerraPower and X Energy, two of those companies, their first demonstration, and then specific funding for a nuclear hydrogen hub. There's also funding in Inflation Reduction Act for that higher enriched fuel and developing a domestic supply chain for that higher enriched fuel. Okay, yes. Mm-hmm.
Just read a book recently about, where our uranium mines have been.
Yes.
Terrible tribal lands, and are there new technologies there, like that we can actually control the safety of that, and the same way that there are materials?
So her question was around where we get the uranium from, and there is a terrible, terrible history of uranium mining in the US, mostly in Navajo Nation. It's not a technological issue. The US was just very racist, and they had like white miners who were doing uranium mining had all the safety gear, and they just didn't even bother with the indigenous miners. So where most of the uranium we get today, the big suppliers are Australia, Canada, Kazakhstan. They all have very good environmental protection and monitoring, very good worker protections. Don't trust me on that. I mean, there's lots of regulations around this, particularly in Australia and Canada, but even Kazakhstan, I was surprised to learn. I'll point you, actually, my next slide. We did a big deep dive on this because that is a concern we have as an organization that's focused on environmental justice and nuclear. We think the US should have a domestic supply of nuclear fuel. That doesn't mean we think there should be new uranium mining in the US. Also, the uranium in the US just isn't good quality, so it just doesn't make sense. We could import the raw uranium from Canada, Australia, Kazakhstan, and do the fuel fabrication here. So there's different parts of the fuel cycle. And because of that fuel density, it's not like we need to mine it here for it to be sort of energy secure and domestic. Yeah, question. Yeah.
So just like what happened, accountability.
Yeah, so that question was about life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from the uranium fuel cycle. I have an appendix slide on the life cycle emissions. They are well tracked and well understood. Again, because of that fuel density, the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from nuclear are lower than renewable energy, or on par, depending on the renewable energy. But yes, those are definitely tracked. And renewables also have a lot of mining, and that's something that's coming to the forefront now. But everyone's mining should have good protections and good worker protections and environmental regulations. So, okay, issues, fuel supply. It's really about enriching the fuel is the big constraint right now. Even though very small amount of uranium was coming out of Russia, Russia was the largest enricher of nuclear fuels. It's very well-known technology. It's done in a lot of places. We're just ramping up those capabilities. And there's a lot of funding from those recent legislations to build up US capacity, particularly the company Westinghouse, which is US, has been ramping up enrichment activities. The other big one is spent fuel. So every 2 years when you refuel your reactor, you have this spent fuel that comes out, needs to be handled very carefully, needs to be stored safely. But then what do you do with it after? And the tricky part is that about 96% of the potential energy is still available in the fuel. It just can't sustain that fission reaction anymore. So what most other countries do, except the US, is they recycle their fuel. Most other countries recycle it once, but there are technologies in some of these advanced reactors allow you to recycle again and again and again until you get all of that energy out. It reduces the amount of time you need to store and the radioactivity of that spent fuel. The US does not reprocess mainly for economic reasons, but France reprocesses fuel for a lot of countries. Japan, Russia, China, even India are all doing reprocessing. Licensing modernization. So when I talked about this big paradigm shift from building nuclear's large infrastructure projects to commercial products, the licensing and the safety regulation around nuclear is still very much in that old paradigm. So they're looking at licensing every plant as this one-off huge project, and they don't really have a system yet for doing bulk licenses the way that aircrafts are licensed. For aircraft, a design is licensed, and then all of the factories are licensed. And then there's certain conditions you can operate that aircraft in under that license. And then the pilots are licensed, of course, and the mechanics. And so that's what we're looking at to actually have modular fabrication of nuclear. You need to have a licensing system that looks more like that. So if the design is safe and the facilities are secure and the operators are licensed, you don't have to license each project as sort of a separate, unique snowflake. And then the last one is global competitiveness. As I mentioned, I didn't have a slide on this, but there are about 30 countries that are working towards building their very first nuclear power plant. Most of them have partnerships with Russia and China for their first project. The US used to be the largest exporter of commercial nuclear technology. We've fallen out as our own industry has struggled, but there's a lot of interest, particularly from these companies, to build first in the US and demonstrate, and then focus mainly on exports. But the US has some challenges competing in that market. Particularly, we don't offer the sort of generous financing packages that Russia and China do for projects like this. So there's policies that are in the works around export financing, development financing, and then bilateral trade agreements, be more proactive about bilateral trade agreements, the way that Russia and China are, and South Korea also.
Jessica, there's a question. Let's kind of go back to an earlier point. The question was, is there a, I guess I'll just read it, it's written, at least while I'll ask. I'm assuming mining desks per megawatt are much lower for nuclear than for coal.
Yes, per megawatt, definitely. Their uranium mining is almost entirely done above ground. So just off the top of my head, it's much safer. It's also, because it's radioactive, extremely protective measures around safety. Yeah, okay, we're almost done. Just some recent policy work that has come out of Good Energy that you might be interested, because a lot of you ask these questions. We have a report on nuclear justice, which is really diving into the details of all of the problems in nuclear. So mining, weapons, siting, lots of all of them. And we do propose some potential policy solutions for some of them. We have a whole report on sustainable and ethical uranium mining. And then the last one is a deep dive we did on opportunities for coal communities through nuclear energy. So it was a report on coal repowering, but more focused on the needs of communities and the workers that currently are operating coal plants and have coal power plants that are retiring soon. And then I am sort of an academic. So I did just want to throw up here a bunch of papers I've published on different topics. I'm just gonna not be humble for a second and say I'm quite well known for the first paper on nuclear costs and why nuclear is so expensive. The second paper looks a little bit more into the details of could SMRs actually be cheaper? How does that work? Is it real? Social license, that's the third paper. How do you actually gain community support for these projects? And then something that just might be of interest to folks, certain folks, have this paper that came out last year on land use intensity of electricity production, and what that means for future decarbonized grids. And then the last paper came out last month, and it was looking at the economics and technical feasibility of microreactors for off-grid and microgrid applications. And I got hourly electric demand data for real communities and looked at potential if they could meet their demand reliably with nuclear and a mix of nuclear and renewables. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, speaker first.
Great talk. So you mentioned coal to nuclear. I'm sure you mean also gas to nuclear. Not.
It depends. So it makes more sense to do coal to nuclear for some technical reasons, particularly around water. But sure, you could do anything. You could do oil.
I think in California there's very little coal.
Yes. This is more of a concern in the Mountain West, like Wyoming, Idaho. And also there's a lot of interest in Appalachia around coal plants closing. So
my real question is, if you were to pick a sweet spot in terms of, say, power, from kilowatt to gigawatt, where would it be?
So I think there's not an optimal. I think the term that we see is right sizing. So different markets have different needs. And so maybe for the US context, for coal, if you have a coal power plant that's retiring, a really good size for a nuclear reactor is 600 megawatts. That's like a average coal power plant size. For community, so for a university campus, for example, 10 megawatts is a really good size. So a larger microreactor might be a good fit for that, or a hospital complex, something like that. For BRICS countries, China, they are still very interested in the gigawatt scale. So whether it's light water reactors or advanced nuclear, they still want large scale. And there are companies that are designing. South Korea. For, I don't know, middle income, European markets looking to decarbonize, I would say the SMR is probably the best fit. So something maybe in the 100 to 300 megawatts in terms of easy to finance, helps with grid flexibility. That size, you can balance the load easier with smaller reactors. Yeah, so that's a complicated answer, but I think, yeah, depends.
I guess I would disagree a little bit with that, because I think that if you're going to be approaching terawatt production, you need 1 million of these little micro reactors, and that's 1 million problems waiting to happen. It's far better to build as big as possible and get the kilowatt hours into the grid, especially with your old nuclear proposals. It's not hard to upgrade from a 600 megawatt transmission line to a gigawatt. So that's it. You've already have your right of ways. You already have the ability to build a large power plant. Building small things is simply going to delay getting the gigawatts up to terawatt scale and asking for problems. The first micro reactor that has a problem, and there will be problems, as there will be large reactors, will be on the front page of the paper, and it will be a nuclear disaster. And so the idea of building small things that will have much less maintenance, they'll have less staff, they'll have less control, they'll have higher probabilities of failure, is going to delay the real need of having large amounts of power that doesn't produce CO2, which is the real problem. I mean, the only reason that nuclear is to replace CO2 emitting power technology. It's not to power little ski resorts with nice things for the locals where they use a small genset to take care of that. It's to get terawatt scale power. And that requires big projects, enormous scale, and small scale is simply distracting from the main event.
But, okay. I understand that issue. I would encourage you to read paper number 2, that's the entire topic. But my question to you is isn't that how we do solar panels and wind turbines? And they're now starting to add up to 10, 20, 40% of power grids. So they're able to scale up fast because they're so small.
I think that they're scaling up fast and disrupting the grids. What they're doing is that their capacity factor is so low. Sure, you can do manufactured power plants and factories for wind and solar, putting it at smaller allotments. You still need to upgrade grids. You still need somewhere wires with gigawatts of power.
Yeah.
It's not going to come from a few megawatt solar array. It's going to come from a gigawatt power station.
Yeah, so I think that is the appeal of something like NuScale, where the reactor can be factory fabricated, but you add them up and it looks like a traditional power
And
plant.
just one more point on NuScale. NuScale's time to go from drawing board to first installed unit has been more than a decade. And right now we need to get going with building large scale plants and deal with climate change. And right now you're able to build an AP1000 in China using Western contractors at $4 a watt. So you can do it today in 2 to 3 years with existing designs. I'm not a big fan of the AP1000, but nonetheless, it has a great safety record. And with the latest versions, they're convectively cooled. So why would we want to try to license a new technology, which will take a decade, when we can build one off the shelf starting tomorrow at the old plant near you?
Because we can't in the US. We can't build an AP1000 on that timescales in the US. And I agree with that concern that we have to build fast, but we're just not building fast. We're not building renewables fast enough. We're not building nuclear fast enough. And the issue is, even if we get to 100% zero carbon electricity by 2035, which is a big ask, whether that's California or the US, we still then have to decarbonize the rest of the energy sector. So even a decade out, we still need more electricity. We still need more power. And so my perspective is, we accelerate, we push as hard as we can on these. We keep building renewables as fast as we can. We keep building batteries as fast as we can, but we're still, even if some of these technologies aren't commercially ready until 2035, we're still going to need them after 2035. We're still going to need more electricity after 2050 to decarbonize industry and transportation and a continuing growing population. So that's kind of how I view it, as this is a long-term issue. And right now there's a lot of diversity in design. Some of these aren't going to work and some of these aren't going to be successful. And maybe NuScale is not going to be successful, but we have lots of different technology and lots of different business models, I should mention, that we just got to try different things in different states and different places.
Okay, thanks. And thanks, Eric. So Eric's a nuclear engineer, actually. Okay. There's another question in the room and there's another one online as well.
Okay.
And thank you for a very interesting talk. My question is actually related to what you were saying just then about some of the policies that are kind of slowing things down, especially in the US. I was surprised that a lot of the states where they're building these first demonstration reactions are, I guess, notoriously kind of more less progressive, less energy focused states, and they're switching to nuclear. So I'm kind of curious, what are the dynamics that are going on, if you can touch on that briefly, that are affecting how policy is being made?
Yeah, so I mentioned with the legislation that's passed in the last decade, it's very bipartisan, and there is, at least at the federal level, very strong bipartisan support for nuclear. And so I'm just going to be blunt. Republicans love nuclear, and I don't really know the whole reason. I think it's American, it's large scale, it powers industry. There's a lot of nuclear in the southeast where they still have vertically integrated utilities, so they can finance those types of projects. It's places that also have a lot of large hydro, and so they're used to that sort of large scale electricity. And the truth is that for existing nuclear, even for these new plants like Vogel, the electricity is still really cheap and it's still really affordable. And so it wasn't, you know, tongue in cheek for Biden to call it the Inflation Reduction Act. Like, nuclear has often been used as a way to hedge against unstable energy prices due to fossil fuels. So that's still a motivation. And I think energy security is the big reason. I know, so in Sweden, the big shift on nuclear has been driven by the right. And for them, it's because they don't want to be importing fossil fuels. And they don't want rising energy prices from importing electricity from their neighbors. So that's really driving it. So I think, yeah, some nationalism, some energy security. But yeah, there is where we're seeing interest in new nuclear. Appalachia, Southeast, Mountain West, including Colorado, which is more purple, but definitely Wyoming. TerraPower has more projects lined up after that first one, 4 more in Wyoming. So coal communities, I was just out in, last week I was in Paducah, Kentucky, which is really interested. Kentucky is really interested in nuclear because they have a lot of coal communities. And what we're seeing is coal communities starting to think of themselves as energy communities. So for the most part, that very first slide I showed of the power plant, nuclear power plants look a lot like coal power plants on the inside, except for the reactor. And so it's a much more familiar technology. The jobs stayed local. So there's a lot of interest in new nuclear in traditional coal states and coal communities.
Comment from the Zoom session in response to Erickson. Andrew, he said, Stemi said, large-scale power plants best serve base load requirements of the grid. Small-scale resources are dispatchable and better serve dynamic loads. The load and generation of the power grid is becoming more and more dynamic. That is why storage is so important for the grid moving forward. So in other words, that the small, you know, basically supporting your claim, that you need both the large base and also the dynamic part as well.
Yeah.
I would dispute that also, because Germany for a long time.
Well, let me give you the mic's sake.
This is a common misconception.
It's a common misconception that you can't load follow with nuclear power plants. Germany had done that for decades. So load following applications are perfectly well suited for advanced or even standard EWR.
So here, I agree. They have. It is economically disadvantaged to load follow with large reactors. You lose money, but if you need to, you can do it, of course. The smaller the reactor, the easier it is to load follow on a grid, because you can turn them off and on faster. And so that's just one from a, you know, in a imaginary grid where it was 100% nuclear, you know, you can do that. But if you have a lot of renewables on the grid and you need to balance them out, smaller nuclear can make that easier.
Okay, so any final question or two? Oh, we got some more. Okay.
I'm going to put up this slide because I heard you mumbling over there.
All right, we have a question come in. So most of the barriers covered so far are political, socioeconomic oriented, or related to logistics, fuel acquisition, disposal, etc. Are there any major technical barriers needed to accelerate? Are there any major technical barriers or significant technical advances needed to accelerate nuclear adoption?
No, I think, as I said in the beginning, almost all these technologies were demonstrated in the 60s and 70s, whether in the US, Europe, or Russia. It's more commercial viability that we're trying to demonstrate now.
Thank you so much. Let's thank the speaker again. And
Yeah, for a little bit.
people want to come up and chat. Thanks everybody. Thanks everybody for coming.